Who was Thomas Alva Edison? By Margaret Frith, illustrated by John O'Brien. Who was Thomas Alva Edison? One day the Edisons couldn't find 6-year-old Al, as his family called him. They were visiting Al's older sister and her husband on their farm. It was just outside of Milan, Ohio. The year was 1853. Suddenly Al's uncle had an idea. He ran out to the barn and there he found Al sitting on a pile of straw. He was trying to hatch a goose egg. He had seen a hen sitting on her eggs when some baby chicks came out. Al wanted to make a baby goose come out of the egg. The Edisons weren't surprised. They had 3 other children, but their youngest, Al, was the most curious. He would be that way all of his long life. The world was very different when Thomas Alva Edison was a child. No electric light to see by, no recorded music to listen to, no movies to watch. It was Edison who made all of these possible and much more, changing our lives forever. Edison firmly believed in inventions, ones that could make everyday life easier and more comfortable. That is exactly what he accomplished. Thomas Alva Edison was, perhaps, the greatest inventor of his time. Chapter 1. Always Curious. Thomas Alva Edison was born on February 11, 1847, on a cold snowy night in Milan, Ohio. His parents, Nancy and Samuel, named him Thomas after his great-uncle and Alva after Captain Alva Bradley, a good friend of his father. The family didn't call him Tom or Tommy. They called him Al. Little Al wanted to find out everything about the world around him. He went about it like a scientist doing an experiment. He didn't just ask questions, he liked to find out the answers himself. Once Al broke open a bumblebee's nest to see what was inside. Another time he watched birds eat worms and fly off. So Al made a mixture out of water and mashed worms. Then he gave it to a neighbor girl to drink. He wanted to see if eating worms would make her fly. But it just made her sick, and Al got a licking with a birch branch. Nothing stopped Al, not bees, not a licking, not even falling into a grain storage bin. He was walking around the rim of the bin when he fell in. Luckily someone pulled him out by the legs just before he was buried under the wheat. Al's father owned a small grain and timber mill in Milan. Boats like Captain Alva Bradley's carried timber down from Canada across Lake Erie, down the Huron River and through the Milan Canal. There it was cut into logs and planks at mills like Mr. Edison's. Trucks and cars had not yet been invented, and trains didn't come to Milan. But one day a railroad line was built. Trains started chugging into town, and the canal wasn't so important anymore. The railroads were faster and easier to use for carrying things around the country. So when Al was 7, the family moved to a new home in Port Huron, Michigan, more than 100 miles north of Milan. They lived in a big house on the St. Clair River. Al's father did lots of things to earn a living. He worked as a carpenter. He ran a grocery store. He had a vegetable garden. He tried farming. He even built a 100-foot tower overlooking the river. For 25 cents, anyone could climb up and watch the boats go by. The Edisons had only been there a short time when Al caught scarlet fever. It was a serious illness back then without the medicines used today. He ran a high fever. A red rash broke out on his skin. Al got better, but he realized that he couldn't hear as well as he used to, probably because of the scarlet fever. In school, the teacher complained that Al didn't pay attention. He would drift off. Maybe he was bored, or maybe he just couldn't hear everything. One day 8-year-old Al heard his teacher telling someone that he was addled. He meant Al's brain was scrambled. When Al told his mother, she was furious. She took him out of school and began teaching him at home. Al loved to read. How surprised his teacher would have been to see the difficult books his mother gave to him. Books about history, nature, and science. He read them just as fast as he could. One book was a favorite. It was called A School Compendium of Natural and Experimental Philosophy. It was a science book. It talked about electricity, batteries, electrical toys, and a lot more. It had simple experiments. Al got so excited, he started doing experiments all over the house. He used stuff like feathers, beeswax, and chemicals from the drugstore. His bedroom was full of jars and bottles. Finally, his mother sent him to the basement to set up his own lab. Morse code. Samuel Morse was born in Charlestown, Massachusetts. He was a portrait painter for the first half of his life. Morse was always interested in science, especially electricity. He was 41 years old when he had an idea. What about sending messages in code through a wire? The idea came to him while he was on a ship, traveling home from France, where it had taken a whole month for a letter to reach him from America. The simple instrument he built in 1837 worked the very first time. But it wasn't until 1844 that he could send the first official telegram. Morse tapped out words from the Bible, "What hath God wrought?" It went from Washington, D.C., to Baltimore, Maryland, 34 miles away. It took less than a second to travel through the wire. One part in the book interested Al most of all. It was about Morse's telegraphic alphabet. Morse was the name of a code. It was used to send messages over telegraph wires. There were no telephones yet. You couldn't talk to someone far away. But you could send messages that reached them quickly. Samuel Morse made up the code. Instead of using letters and numbers, he used dots and dashes to send messages that became known as telegrams. The railroad played a big part because the telegraph wires that carried telegrams were strung on poles along the railroad tracks. An operator in a railroad station could wire ahead if schedules changed, or if there was an accident or a delay of some kind. Telegraphy made the trains safer. An operator tapped out a message of dots and dashes with a metal key on a board. The message raced along a wire as electrical pulses to the next station. The dots and dashes were notched, or cut, into a roll of paper. An operator decoded the message using Morse code and wrote down the message in words. Telegrams were expensive, so mostly businesses sent them. But people sent them too for news they wanted to get to their families and friends fast, like the birth of a new baby. Al couldn't wait to try it. He made a simple telegraph key, and he began learning Morse code. He even set up a wire between his house and a friend's house nearby. As they learned the code, they began sending messages back and forth. Soon Al would go to work on the railroad. It was there that his interest in telegraphy grew much more serious. Chapter 2. Young Inventor. Al was 12 when his father helped him get a job on the Grand Trunk Railroad. The train traveled back and forth between Port Huron and Detroit, Michigan, every day. Al was a newsboy. Along with other boys, he sold newspapers, magazines, and snacks like candy and peanuts or sandwiches. The train didn't have a dining car. The passengers had to bring their own food or buy it from the boys. The train left Port Huron at 7 in the morning and returned at 9 in the evening. It was a 3-hour journey each way. Al had lots of time in Detroit before the trip back home. Al was not a boy to sit around and do nothing. He spent time at the library reading, mostly science books. He also began to dream up other ways to make money on the train. He bought things from the Detroit market and sold them to train riders on the way home to Port Huron. In Port Huron, he took vegetables from his family's farm and sold them at the station. Then in Detroit, he noticed that a newspaper was throwing out ink, paper, and old pieces of type. Al bought a small printing press and started a weekly newspaper. He called it the Grand Trunk Herald. A subscription cost 8 cents a month. He sold about 200 copies a week. People liked it because it carried local news, train schedules, ads and gossip. Al set up his printing press right there in the baggage car on the train. He also set up a simple lab. He wrote. He printed. He did experiments. The conductor didn't mind. Then one day, one of his chemical mixtures caught fire. The conductor did mind now. He was really angry with Al. He picked him up and threw him off the train along with all his stuff. But Al didn't lose his job as a newsboy. He just couldn't have a lab on the train anymore. In 1861, the Civil War broke out between the North and the South. Michigan was on the side of the North, the side of the President Abraham Lincoln. People were particularly anxious for news. It was not long before Al saw a way to sell even more newspapers. He got a telegraph operator in Detroit to wire the war news of that day ahead to the stations on the way to Port Huron. Operators wrote the news on a chalkboard at the station. By the time the train arrived, people had heard what was happening, and they wanted to read more about the events of the day in the newspaper. Al usually sold about 100 papers. On the day when the sad news came of the terrible battle at Shiloh, Tennessee, where more than 23,000 men were killed or wounded, he sold 1,000 newspapers. Al was a teenager now, and he decided he wanted to be called Tom. From then on he was known as Tom or Thomas. One day Tom saw a train about to hit the station master's 3-year-old son, Jimmy. He dashed onto the tracks and pulled him to safety. As thanks, the station master offered to teach Tom about telegraphy. Tom was thrilled. He already knew Morse code. Here was a chance to learn how to become a real telegraph operator. By now telegrams were not only sent from railroad stations, but from offices owned by a company called Western Union. Tom worked hard and soon he had a new job. He was just 16 when he went to work for Western Union in Port Huron. Later, Tom took jobs with Western Union in other cities. He went from one place to the next. He was getting faster and faster at sending and receiving messages. A good telegrapher could send or receive about 45 words a minute. Tom wanted to be the best. He practiced at night in his room. He liked to tap out plays, like Hamlet, by William Shakespeare. One day a friend told Tom about a job at Western Union in Boston, Massachusetts. It was 1868. The Civil War had ended 3 years before. Now Tom was 21 years old. Off he went. Tom worked at night. During the day he worked on his inventions. He spent time at a machine shop where they could make the parts he needed to build whatever he was working on. This meant that Tom didn't get much sleep. This habit stayed with him all his life. Tom always carried a small notebook in his pocket so he could jot down ideas. The first invention he made that he thought he could sell was an electric voting machine. He had noticed how long it took lawmakers in the Massachusetts legislature to vote. Each vote was written by hand. An electric machine would make voting much faster. Tom applied for a patent from the U.S. government in Washington, D.C. A patent protects the owner of an idea for an invention. It stops someone else from copying it and selling it. The owner gives the date, time, and place where the idea began. The patent also includes a description and sketches of the idea. It stays on file whether the owner makes the invention or not. Over 60 years' time Tom was granted 1,093 patents, more than anybody else, even to this day. Tom tried to sell his voting machine to the state. But the lawmakers didn't want it. They were glad that voting took a long time. This way, they could try and persuade others to change their vote before the voting was over. Tom even went to Washington, D.C., to see if the U.S. Congress wanted it. For the same reason, they didn't. Tom couldn't believe it. He decided right then that he would never make any invention unless he was sure people wanted it. It was the only way to make money. Tom didn't want to be an inventor to become rich. But he understood that it took money to make his ideas happen. Tom wrote articles about telegraphy. People read them and admired the young inventor. Many called him a genius. Some even wanted to give him money to help him invent things. They were called investors. So Tom quit his job at Western Union. Now he would spend all of his time inventing.